The Manhattan skyline glittered against the night sky as our car navigated through traffic toward the Plaza Hotel, where New York's elite gathered under the pretense of charity, while actually conducting the real business of social positioning and strategic alliances. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, and I focused on breathing steadily, channeling every lesson from the meditation app I'd downloaded during my engagement to Harrison, when panic attacks had become routine enough to require management strategies. Dante's hand covered mine, warm and steady. Remember, you're not the scandal tonight. You're the story everyone wishes they dared to live themselves. Woman walks away from loveless arrangement, chooses passion over duty, reunites with the one who got away. That's not shameful, Sophia. That's aspirational. Tell that to the 300 people who are about to stare at me like I'm a zoo exhibit, I muttered. But his reframing helped marginally. Perspective mattered. I could walk in there as the girl who'd embarrassed her family, or I could enter as the woman who'd finally chosen herself. The facts were identical, but the framing changed everything. The car pulled up to the red carpet, because of course there was a red carpet, and camera flashes erupted like lightning strikes. Paparazzi lined both sides of the entrance, shouting questions and names, creating chaos designed to disorient and overwhelm. Dante exited first, moving around to open my door with old-fashioned courtesy that I suspected was calculated for the cameras, but appreciated anyway. His hand extended toward me, steady and sure, an anchor point in the manufactured storm. I took it, letting him help me from the car, and the camera flashes intensified. Questions bombarded us from all directions, voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Sophia, do you regret leaving Harrison? Dante, how does it feel having her back? Is this revenge or romance? What does your father think? Dante's arm slid around my waist, pulling me close, and we walked forward without acknowledging the questions. He'd coached me during the drive. Please don't talk with paparazzi, don't give them sound bites. Just smile and move with confidence, as if their opinions are irrelevant. It wasn't easy when every instinct screamed to defend myself, explain, and make them understand. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere shifted from chaotic to coldly judgmental. The charity gala occupied the grand ballroom, decorated with understated elegance that cost more than most people's weddings. Flowers everywhere, massive arrangements that would be discarded tomorrow, crystal chandeliers reflecting light across surfaces designed to dazzle. This was my world, the environment I'd been raised to navigate, but tonight it felt hostile in ways it never had before. Conversations didn't stop when we entered, but they shifted. Voices lowered fractionally, eyes tracked our movement with predatory interest. I recognized dozens of faces, people I'd known my entire life, family, friends, and business associates who suddenly treated me like I'd committed treason rather than simply canceling a wedding. Sophia Chen. The voice came from behind us, cultured and cold. Harrison Whitmore looked exactly as he always did, perfectly groomed and expensively dressed, carrying himself with entitled confidence. Except now, there was an edge to his expression, something sharp beneath the polished exterior. I didn't expect you to show your face quite so quickly after your dramatic exit. Dante's hand tightened on my waist, a silent message of support and warning. I forced myself to meet Harrison's gaze directly, refusing to cower or apologize. Harrison, I said, proud that my voice remained steady. I'm sorry for the way things ended. You deserved better than finding out through other people. But I'm not sorry for the decision itself. We would have made each other miserable. What I know is that you cost me considerable embarrassment and damaged a business arrangement your father and I spent months negotiating. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. But I suppose I should thank you for revealing your character before we were legally bound. Much cleaner this way, discovering you're unstable before signing contracts. The casual cruelty of calling me unstable, echoing my father's psychiatric commitment threat, made anger flare hot. But before I could respond, Dante spoke, his voice carrying quiet menace that made Harrison step backward. Careful, Whitmore. Insulting my fiancé publicly isn't strategic, especially given how easily certain information about your past relationships could reach people very interested in patterns of behavior toward women. Dante's smile was all teeth. I'm sure your board would love to review those settlements and NDAs you thought were buried. Harrison's composure cracked fractionally, fear flickering across his features. Are you threatening me, Moretti? I'm stating facts. What you do with them is your decision. Dante guided me past Harrison with dismissive ease. Enjoy the evening. Try not to harass more women into signing non-disclosure agreements. We moved deeper into the ballroom, and I was shaking, adrenaline flooding my system. That was incredibly satisfying and terrifying simultaneously, I admitted. Does he actually have that many skeletons, or were you bluffing? I never bluff about leverage. Dante steered us toward the bar and ordered wine. Harrison Whitmore believes money makes him untouchable. Men like that always have secrets, usually too arrogant to hide them carefully. Your instinct to run was sound. The bartender handed us wine in crystal glasses, and I took a grateful sip. Around us, the gala continued its choreography of wealth and influence. People air-kissed in complimented outfits while mentally calculating net worth. Servers circulated with appetizers, more art than food. A string quartet provided an elegant soundtrack to elegant people conducting inelegant business. More guests approached throughout the evening, some offering genuine congratulations, others clearly fishing for details they could turn into gossip. Dante handled each interaction with practiced ease, charming when necessary, dismissive when appropriate, always maintaining control of conversations that threatened to become uncomfortable. I watched him work the room and understood why he'd been successful in his world. He read people instantly, adjusted his approach accordingly, and gave them exactly what they needed to feel satisfied while revealing nothing he didn't want known. By 10 o'clock, my feet ached from heels, and my face hurt from maintaining pleasant expressions through countless tedious conversations. Dante must have noticed because he leaned close, his breath warm against my ear. You've done brilliantly tonight. Want to escape before the formal program starts and they trap us here for another 2 hours of speeches? God, yes, I breathed, relief flooding through me. How do we leave without it looking like we're running away? We don't leave. We relocate. His hand found the small of my back, guiding me toward a side exit I hadn't noticed. There's a private lounge upstairs where the real conversations happen after people tire of performing for the masses. Much smaller group, more interesting company, significantly better alcohol. The private lounge Dante mentioned turned out to be a penthouse suite, converted into an exclusive gathering space for people who'd transcended the need to impress anyone. No pretense here. Just comfortable furniture, dim lighting, and a dozen individuals who operated at levels of wealth and power that made the gala downstairs look like amateur hour. I recognized a few faces from financial news coverage, a tech billionaire who'd revolutionized social media, a fashion designer whose name appeared on half the labels in my borrowed wardrobe, and a woman I was pretty confident controlled significant portions of Manhattan real estate through strategically concealed holding companies. Dante navigated the space with easy familiarity, greeting people by name and making introductions that positioned me as a partner rather than an accessory. These weren't the social climbers and status seekers from downstairs. These were people who'd already climbed as high as it went, and now operated by entirely different rules. Money wasn't impressive here because everyone had absurd amounts of it. Power wasn't noteworthy because it was assumed to be there. What mattered in this room was something more difficult to define. A combination of intelligence and ruthlessness, and the particular charisma that came from being genuinely dangerous. So you're the one who finally got Dante Moretti to settle down, the tech billionaire said, extending his hand with a smile that suggested he knew precisely how calculated our relationship actually was. Marcus Chen, no relation to your family despite the name. I've been trying to convince Dante to invest in my latest venture for 6 months, but he keeps insisting he needs to focus on personal matters. Now I understand what he meant. Sophia, I replied, shaking his hand while trying to decode the subtext. Was he genuinely fooled by our performance? Or was this another layer of social maneuvering I didn't understand yet? And I can't take credit for settling him down. I think we're both still figuring out what this is. Honesty, Marcus said, seeming pleased. Rare quality in our circles. Most people are so busy performing their relationships for social media and investors that they forget to actually have them. He glanced at Dante with something that might have been respect. You always did have excellent instincts about people. If you trust her enough to bring her here, that says something significant. The comment reminded me that this wasn't just a social gathering. This was Dante introducing me to his real circle, the people who mattered in his actual world, rather than the performance of society functions. It should have felt like an honor to be granted access to this inner sanctum. Instead, It felt like stepping deeper into commitments I didn't fully understand, implications that extended far beyond our 3-month arrangement. A woman in her 40s approached, elegant in the way that came from bone structure and confidence rather than effort. "Dante, darling, I see you've been busy causing scandals while I was in Milan." Her accent suggested European education, though I couldn't place the origin precisely. "And this must be the bride who preferred grand theft aircraft to matrimony. I approve of your priorities immensely, though I question your taste in private jets. Surely you could have found something more interesting than a Gulfstream if you're going to commit federal aviation crimes." "Next time I'll aim higher," I said, matching her dry tone because instinct suggested showing weakness to this particular woman would be fatal. "Perhaps something military. Really commit to the felony charges." She laughed, genuine and delighted. "Oh, I like her. Dante, you can keep this one." She extended a hand heavy with rings that probably cost more than cars. "Adriana Volkov. I handle certain financial matters for people who prefer discretion. If you ever need to move money in ways that avoid paternal oversight, I'm extraordinarily talented at creating complexity that defeats even the most determined forensic accountants." The casual offer of assistance with what was essentially money laundering should have alarmed me more than it did. But exhaustion, wine, and the surreal nature of the entire evening had apparently dulled my moral alarm system to the point where financial crimes barely registered on my concern scale. Besides, she was right that I'd eventually need access to money my father couldn't freeze or control, and having options seemed prudent. "I'll keep that in mind," I said carefully. "Thank you." Dante guided me to a corner where we could observe the room without being immediately approached by others. He handed me a glass of something amber that definitely wasn't wine, and I took a sip, the burn of excellent whiskey steadying nerves I hadn't realized were fraying. "These are your real friends," I said quietly, processing what I'd just witnessed. "Not the people at the gala or the business associates you meet for legitimate deals. These are the ones who actually know what you do and don't care because they operate in similar spaces." "These are my people," Dante confirmed. "The ones I trust with information that could destroy me if they chose to use it. The ones who've had my back through situations where loyalty was literally life or death. I wanted you to meet them because if you're going to be part of my world for the next 3 months, you need to understand what that world actually looks like beyond the polished exterior." "Why?" I turned to face him fully. "We have an arrangement, a temporary performance. Why does it matter if I understand your real life when I'll be gone in 90 days anyway?" Something complicated flickered across his expression, vulnerability showing through the usual control. "Because maybe I'm hoping you won't want to leave. Because maybe the performance is becoming something real for me. And I need you to see all of it before you decide whether that's something you could want too." He set down his glass, hands framing my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about where we were and who surrounded us. I told myself I could keep this transactional, that 3 months of pretending would be enough to repair my reputation and satisfy whatever complicated feelings I still had about you walking away. But watching you tonight, seeing you handle Harrison and navigate the gala and meet my actual friends without judgment, I'm realizing I don't want this to end when the 90 days are up. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Dante, that wasn't part of our agreement. You promised me freedom after 3 months, and you'll have it," he said quickly. "If that's what you want, I'll keep my word absolutely. Transportation anywhere, money to start over, complete freedom from obligation. But I'm asking you to consider the possibility that freedom doesn't have to mean leaving. That maybe choosing to stay could be its own kind of liberation, if it's genuinely what you want, rather than what you're obligated to do." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't commit me to something I wasn't ready to promise, my phone vibrated insistently in the small clutch I'd been carrying all evening. I'd been ignoring notifications for hours, but something about the persistence made me check. 12 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, 3 voicemails, and a text message that made my blood turn to ice. It was from my younger sister Jessica, using a phone I didn't have saved in my contacts. "Sophia, please call me back. Father's done something. I don't know how to handle this alone. It's bad." Jessica was 19, a sophomore at Columbia studying international relations and generally staying out of family drama by being the good daughter I'd apparently failed to be. We weren't particularly close, separated by 7 years and fundamentally different approaches to dealing with our father's control. She complied where I rebelled, agreed where I questioned, and I'd always assumed she was either more mature or less bothered by the constraints that had made me desperate enough to hijack an aircraft. "I need to make a call," I said to Dante, my voice tight with anxiety I couldn't quite conceal. "My sister. Something's wrong." He understood immediately, the way he seemed to understand most things without requiring extensive explanation. "Use the private office. Second door on the left. Completely secure, no one will interrupt." His hand squeezed my shoulder briefly. "Take whatever time you need. I'll keep people occupied out here." The office was exactly what I'd expected from a space designed for influential people conducting sensitive business. Soundproofed walls, multiple phone lines, and computer equipment that looked both expensive and encrypted. I closed the door and called Jessica back, my hands shaking as I waded through the rings. "Sophia," her voice broke on my name, and I could hear the tears she was trying to control. "Oh God, I didn't know if you'd call back. I didn't know what to do or who else to contact." "Jess, slow down. Tell me what happened." I forced myself to sound calm even though panic was rising in my chest. "What did Father do?" "He called a family meeting tonight. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and everyone important in the Chen family structure. He told them you'd had a mental breakdown, that you were unstable and dangerous to yourself, that he was pursuing legal options to have you committed for your own protection." Her words tumbled out in a rush. "He showed them documentation from doctors he'd consulted, psychiatric evaluations you supposedly had done that diagnosed you with various disorders. He made it sound like you've been deteriorating for months, and the wedding situation was just the final evidence that you need involuntary treatment." My worst fear, the threat he'd made before the wedding, was actually happening. He was building a case to have me declared incompetent, creating a paper trail of mental illness that would justify forcing me into psychiatric care, where he could control every aspect of my existence under the guise of treatment. "Those evaluations are fabricated," I said, though my voice shook with the realization that truth didn't matter if he had enough documentation and medical professionals willing to support his narrative. "I've never been evaluated by any psychiatrist. He's manufacturing evidence. I know that." I told them that. "But Sophia, he's convincing. He has dates and detailed reports, and even a video he claims shows you exhibiting erratic behavior over the past 6 months." Jessica's voice dropped to a whisper. "He showed footage of you at family dinners where he'd apparently edited things to make you look unstable. Moments taken out of context, conversations cut to change meaning. It was horrifying watching him rewrite reality so thoroughly that even people who know you started questioning whether maybe he was right. The systematic nature of his manipulation took my breath away. This wasn't something he'd arranged in the 2 days since I'd left. This was long-term planning, months of collecting footage, building a case, and positioning himself to destroy my credibility if I ever stepped too far out of line. The wedding to Harrison had been his preferred outcome. Still, he'd prepared for the possibility that I might refuse by creating an alternative where he could force compliance through psychiatric imprisonment. "What did you tell them?" I asked, trying to focus on immediate problems rather than the larger horror of how thoroughly my father had been orchestrating my potential captivity. "I told them you seemed fine to me, that I hadn't noticed any concerning behavior, that maybe Father was overreacting because he was embarrassed about the canceled wedding." Jessica paused. "They didn't believe me. Or they chose not to believe me because it's easier to accept Father's version, where you're sick, rather than facing the possibility that you left. After all, you were miserable. Sophia, they're talking about forming an intervention team, coming to find you, bringing doctors, forcing you into treatment whether you agree or not. They can't do that legally without court orders and proper psychiatric holds," I said. Though even as I spoke, I realized how naive that sounded. People with enough money and influence didn't always worry about legal niceties, especially when they believed they were acting in someone's best interest. "I'm an adult. I have rights. You have rights until Father convinces a judge you're incompetent to exercise them." Jessica's voice steadied slightly, fear giving way to determination. "He's already filing petitions. He has lawyers preparing emergency psychiatric holds. Sophia, I did some research after the meeting. In New York, if family members can demonstrate that someone is a danger to themselves, they can get temporary commitments approved very quickly, sometimes within hours. And once you're involuntarily committed, even temporarily, it becomes much harder to fight the longer-term orders. The legal trap was elegant in its simplicity. Get me committed on an emergency basis using fabricated evidence of a mental health crisis, then use that initial commitment as proof that longer-term treatment was necessary. Each step would make the next step easier to justify, until eventually I'd be so thoroughly entangled in the psychiatric system that escaping would become nearly impossible, especially against a father with unlimited resources to pay doctors who'd confirm whatever diagnosis justified continued control. "I'm not in New York," I said, grasping at the hope that geography might provide some protection. "I'm not even in the state anymore. His jurisdiction doesn't extend beyond certain boundaries." "Where are you?" Jessica asked. "Maybe I can research what protections you have in that state, what the commitment laws are like, and whether he can transport you across state lines for treatment." I hesitated, unwilling to share my exact location, even with my sister. Not because I didn't trust Jessica, but because I didn't trust that my father wasn't monitoring her communications the same way he'd apparently been monitoring mine for years. If he was as thorough as Dante suggested, Jessica's phone was almost certainly compromised. "I can't tell you specifically," I said carefully, "but I'm safe. I'm with people who can protect me legally and physically. And I'm going to fight this, Jess. I'm not going to let him rewrite my sanity just because I refuse to marry the man he chose. Be careful." My sister's voice was thick with emotion. Father's furious, angrier than I've ever seen him. Not yelling or obvious rage, but that cold, calculated fury where he's absolutely certain he's right and everyone else is wrong. That's when he's most dangerous, when he's completely convinced his actions are justified. We talked for a few more minutes, me reassuring her that I was okay, and her promising to keep me updated on any new developments in the family situation. When I finally ended the call, I sat in the office chair feeling hollowed out, exhausted by the constant vigilance required to stay ahead of my father's machinations. Dante was waiting just outside the office door when I emerged, his expression suggesting he'd been monitoring for when I finished, rather than returning to socialize. "Bad news?" "The worst." I gave him the abbreviated version, watching his face darken as I explained my father's psychiatric commitment strategy. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. At every family dinner, in every interaction, he was apparently collecting footage to use against me if necessary. I thought leaving would be the hardest part. Turns out escaping is going to be exponentially more complicated than just physically removing myself from his vicinity. "He can't touch you here," Dante said with absolute certainty. "New York commitment laws don't apply in other jurisdictions. And even if he somehow got federal involvement, I have resources he can't match. Legal teams, psychiatric experts who'll testify you're completely sound, documentation of his controlling behavior that establishes a pattern of manipulation rather than legitimate concern." His hand settled on my shoulders, grounding me when I felt like I might fragment from stress. "Your father is powerful in his world, Sophia, but his world doesn't overlap with mine as much as he probably thinks it does. You're safe. I promise you that absolutely." I wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the certainty he projected, as if it were a shield that could actually protect me from my father's reach. But years of experience with Richard Chen had taught me that underestimating him was always a mistake, that he didn't make threats he couldn't back up, and that his meticulous planning usually accounted for variables other people never considered. If he were pursuing psychiatric commitment, he'd already wargamed the scenarios where I might resist, calculated the jurisdictional complications, and developed strategies to overcome every obstacle I could possibly deploy. "My father doesn't give up," I said quietly, pulling away from Dante's touch because accepting comfort made me weak, and I needed to stay sharp. "Once he's decided on a course of action, he pursues it with absolute commitment until he succeeds or finds a better alternative. And right now, destroying my credibility by having me declared mentally incompetent serves multiple purposes for him. It explains the canceled wedding to his business associates without making him look like he failed to control his daughter. It removes me as a potential embarrassment if I continue making choices he disapproves of. And it reestablishes his authority over my life in ways that are legally defensible and socially acceptable. Then we need to move faster than he does." Dante pulled out his phone, typing rapidly while simultaneously talking. "I'm activating a legal team that specializes in defending against exactly this type of situation. We'll file preemptive documentation, establishing your mental competence through an independent psychiatric evaluation. Get testimony from people who've interacted with you recently, confirming you're rational and functioning well. Create a counter-narrative that positions his commitment attempts as abuse rather than concern. That still requires me to prove I'm sane, which puts me in the defensive position." I started pacing, my mind working through scenarios and possibilities the way I'd been trained in business school to analyze complex strategic problems. What if instead of defending against his attack, we go on offense? What if we expose his real motivations? Show that this isn't about mental health but about control and the business deals my marriage represented. You'd need evidence, Dante said, but his expression suggested he was already following my logic. Documentation of his business arrangements with the Whitmore family, proof that your wedding was fundamentally a corporate merger rather than a genuine relationship. Ideally, something showing he valued the deal over your actual well-being. He kept files, I said, memory surfacing from months ago when I'd been looking for something in his home office and stumbled across documents I probably wasn't supposed to see. Contract drafts for the merger, emails with Harrison's father's father discussing terms of the arrangement, even a spreadsheet calculating the financial value of combining the companies through our marriage. I didn't think much of it at the time, because arranged marriages in our social circle aren't unusual, but context changes interpretation. If people understood he was literally pricing my worth in quarterly projections, the psychiatric commitment looks less like concerned parenting and more like eliminating a liability that damaged his portfolio. Can you access those files? Dante's focus sharpened, and I recognized the expression from earlier when he'd been handling Harrison's threats. This was Dante in tactical mode, calculating angles and advantages with the same precision he probably brought to whatever criminal enterprises funded his elaborate lifestyle. They're in his personal server, which I can't physically access now that I've left his house. I thought through options, digital pathways I might exploit, but I still have login credentials to the family network from when I worked at Chen Technologies. He probably hasn't revoked my access yet because that would require acknowledging I'm not coming back, which contradicts his mental illness narrative. If he's telling everyone I'm having a breakdown, he can't simultaneously lock me out of systems without revealing he doesn't actually expect me to return home for treatment. So we have a narrow window before he realizes that security gap and closes it. Dante was already moving toward the office I'd just vacated. Can you get in remotely and extract what we need? Or do you require equipment you don't have access to? I can get in from any computer with internet access. The files themselves might be encrypted, but I know his encryption passwords because he used to make me help organize sensitive documents when his assistant was unavailable. I followed Dante back into the office, adrenaline replacing exhaustion as possibilities crystallized into an actual plan. Give me 20 minutes and full permission to commit corporate espionage against my own family. You have whatever you need. Dante gestured to the computer setup, high-end equipment that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything on this system is routed through VPN protocols that make tracing nearly impossible, and we have technology staff who can cover tracks even if your father's security team tries to identify the access point. Take what you need and don't worry about consequences. I'll handle any fallout. I settled into the office chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard, while my conscience made one last attempt to assert itself. This was theft. Corporate espionage. Potentially illegal, depending on how intellectual property laws interacted with family business structures. It was also the only way to protect myself from being forcibly committed to psychiatric treatment I didn't need. Sometimes survival required compromising principles you'd always assumed were non-negotiable, and apparently, this was my moment to discover precisely how flexible my morals could become under sufficient pressure. The login credentials still worked, which validated my theory that my father hadn't fully processed the permanence of my departure. I navigated through familiar directory structures, finding the personal folders where he stored sensitive information he didn't trust to subordinates or official company servers. The wedding contracts were exactly where I remembered them. Detailed agreements between Chen Technologies and Whitmore Pharmaceuticals outlining merger terms, profit-sharing arrangements, and voting rights distributions, all contingent on the successful marriage between Harrison and me, creating a permanent, binding relationship between the families. What I hadn't seen before, what I'd apparently missed during my brief previous glimpse of these files, were the additional documents outlining contingency plans if the marriage failed. Penalties my father would owe Harrison's family, reputation damage protocols, and, most damningly, a section discussing alternate strategies for securing the merger that included having me declared incompetent so that my father could exercise legal control over my voting shares and proceed with business arrangements without requiring my consent. He planned this months ago, I said, feeling sick as I scrolled through dates on the documents. Before he even announced my engagement to Harrison, He was already preparing for the possibility that I'd refuse by creating a legal framework to strip my autonomy if necessary. The psychiatric commitment wasn't reactive to my running away. It was always the backup plan. Dante read over my shoulder, his body tense with barely contained fury. Copy everything. Every file, every email, every piece of documentation that shows this was a calculated business strategy rather than parental concern. We're going to bury him with his own meticulous record-keeping. I copied files to an encrypted drive Dante provided, watching progress bars fill while simultaneously feeling something fundamental shift in how I understood my entire relationship with my father. I'd always known he was controlling, that he valued business success over emotional connection, that he saw me more as an asset than a daughter. But I'd told myself that beneath the cold pragmatism was genuine care, that his need to manage my life came from love expressed poorly rather than a complete absence of paternal feeling. These files destroyed that comfortable fiction. Richard Chen didn't love me in any meaningful sense. He valued me the way someone values property, useful when it performs intended functions, disposable when it fails to generate expected returns. The psychiatric commitment wasn't about helping me. It was about eliminating an asset that had become a liability, removing my ability to make choices that conflicted with his business interests by legally defining me as incapable of rational decision-making. Done, I said when the last file finished copying. I have everything we need to prove this was never about my mental health. What do we do with it? First, we document its existence with multiple independent parties so he can't claim we fabricated evidence. Dante took the encrypted drive and connected it to a different system that I assumed handled secure transmission. Copies to my legal team, your independent psychiatric evaluators, journalists who specialize in corporate malfeasance, and a few strategic friends who'd find this information useful for their own purposes. By tomorrow morning, enough people will have this documentation that your father can't suppress it even if he tries. The exposure of my father's files went live at 6 the next morning, coordinated across multiple platforms simultaneously in a way that suggested Dante had extensive experience orchestrating information warfare. The business news networks picked it up first, framing it as a corporate scandal about an executive using a psychiatric commitment to control voting shares. Then the mainstream outlets found the human interest angle. Daughter escaping arranged marriage discovers father planned to have her declared incompetent if she refused. Social media exploded with outrage. The story perfectly calibrated to trigger maximum emotional response across every demographic. By noon, Richard Chen was trending nationally, and not in ways that would help his business relationships or social standing. I watched it unfold from the safety of Dante's estate, scrolling through headlines and commentary, feeling a mix of vindication and guilt. My father deserved exposure for his manipulations, for the systematic way he'd planned to strip my autonomy if I didn't comply with his business arrangements. But he was still my father, the man who'd raised me alone after my mother died, who'd provided every material advantage even if he'd entirely failed at emotional connection. Destroying him publicly felt necessary and terrible simultaneously, a victory that tasted like ash, because winning required burning down what remained of our family relationship. "You're having regrets," Dante observed, appearing with coffee I hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Second-guessing whether exposing him was the right choice despite having no real alternative that didn't end with you in psychiatric custody. I'm wondering if there was a middle path I didn't see because I was too angry to look for it. I accepted the coffee, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. Maybe I could have negotiated with him privately, found some compromise that didn't require destroying his reputation in business relationships. Maybe this was excessive retaliation for what amounts to him being a controlling parent, which isn't exactly rare in families like ours. Sophia, listen to me carefully. Dante sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. What your father did wasn't normal parental control. It was systematic abuse disguised as concern, years of surveillance and manipulation, and planning how to eliminate your free will if you ever challenged his authority. The psychiatric commitment wasn't a theoretical threat. It was an active conspiracy with documentation, and doctors already prepared to testify that you were incompetent. If we hadn't exposed him first, you'd be in a facility right now being forcibly medicated, while he convinced the world he was saving you from yourself. Logically, I knew he was right. Emotionally, I was struggling with the reality that I'd just weaponized my father's own documentation to destroy him, and there was no coming back from that. Whatever relationship we'd had, however dysfunctional and transactional, was permanently severed. I'd orphaned myself effectively, choosing freedom over family in the most public and irreversible way possible. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer instead of sending it to voicemail. "Hello? Sophia?" My father's voice was controlled, each word measured and precise, signaling that he was absolutely furious but refusing to show it. "I assume you're satisfied with the damage you've caused. The board is calling for my resignation. 3 major clients have suspended contracts pending investigation. Your actions have cost the company approximately $200 million in market value in 6 hours. I hope your petty rebellion was worth destroying everything I built." The guilt his words were designed to trigger flickered and died against the hard truth that he'd been willing to have me committed to psychiatric treatment to maintain business relationships. "You were going to imprison me," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "You collected months of footage, editing it to make me look unstable. You consulted doctors about having me declared incompetent, and you planned the entire strategy before I even refused to marry Harrison. Don't pretend you're the victim here when you were actively conspiring to strip my legal rights. I was protecting you from yourself," my father countered, and I could hear that he genuinely believed it. "You've always been impulsive, emotional, unable to see beyond immediate gratification to understand strategic necessity. The psychiatric evaluation would have been temporary, just until you regained perspective and understood that your role in this family comes with responsibilities you can't simply abandon because you're feeling rebellious." "Temporary psychiatric commitment," I repeated, anger rising hot and clean. "You actually believe that's a reasonable response to me not wanting to marry someone? You're so convinced your business interests matter more than my autonomy that you can't even hear how insane that sounds. What's insane is throwing away your family, your position, your future for some romantic fantasy with Dante Moretti." My father's voice hardened. "Do you actually believe he cares about you, Sophia? Or is it more likely that he saw an opportunity to damage my business interests and embarrass me publicly by taking advantage of your naive desperation? You're being used, and you're too foolish to recognize it." The accusation hit harder than it should have, because some part of me had wondered the same thing during quiet moments when Dante's meticulous planning felt more strategic than romantic. But I also remembered the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd admitted wanting our arrangement to become real. The genuine anger when he'd seen my father's files, the way he'd protected me without asking for anything beyond what we'd already agreed to. "Maybe I am being used," I said slowly. "Maybe Dante did see me as an opportunity to cause problems for you. But you know what the difference is between him and you? He gave me a choice. Every step of the way, he's made it clear that I can leave whenever I want, and that our arrangement has an expiration date unless I choose otherwise. I don't remember you giving me a choice. You just expected compliance and planned to force it if I refused. So yes, I'm choosing the person who treats me like I have agency over the one who tried to have me declared incompetent for disagreeing with his business strategy. Then you've made your decision." My father's voice went cold, the verbal equivalent of a door closing. "Consider yourself disowned, Sophia. I'll be filing paperwork to remove you from all family trusts, company voting shares, and inheritance arrangements. You want independence so badly. Let's see how you manage it without access to the Chen family resources. I give you 6 months before you come crawling back, apologizing and begging for reinstatement." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone and trying to process what had just happened. Disowned, cut off financially, removed from the family structure that had defined my entire identity for 26 years. It should have terrified me, the prospect of navigating life without the safety net of Chen's wealth and connections. Instead, I felt almost relieved, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until it was suddenly removed. "He disowned me," I said to Dante, who'd been sitting quietly throughout the entire conversation. "No more family money, no inheritance, no trust fund. He's making sure I understand exactly what choosing myself over his control is going to cost." "Good," Dante said, surprising me. "Now you're completely free from any obligation to him, legal or emotional. He can't use family loyalty or future inheritance as leverage, because there's no future there anymore. It's a clean break, painful but ultimately liberating." The weeks following my father's disownment blurred together in a strange combination of media attention, legal proceedings, and the surprisingly domestic routine of actually living with Dante rather than just performing our relationship for public consumption. His legal team successfully blocked my father's psychiatric commitment attempts by producing independent evaluations from 3 separate psychiatrists, confirming I was entirely mentally competent. The documented evidence of his business motivations destroyed any remaining credibility he might have had about acting from genuine concern. Within a month, Richard Chen had resigned from his position at Chen Technologies, citing personal reasons. At the same time, everyone understood it was a forced removal by a board that couldn't afford a further scandal. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt hollow, like I'd won a battle but lost something fundamental in the process. Jessica called occasionally, for carefully neutral conversations in which she updated me on family developments without explicitly choosing sides. Most of my extended family had sided with my father, viewing my exposure of private documents as unforgivable betrayal, regardless of what those documents contained. A few cousins quietly reached out, expressing support, but unable to make it public without risking their positions in the family business. I understood, but it still hurt to realize how conditional most of those relationships had been. Dante gave me space to process the grief without pushing me to perform happiness I didn't feel. We maintained our public appearances, attending events and being photographed together in ways that fed the narrative of our reunited romance. But privately, he let me exist in whatever emotional state I needed, sitting silently when I didn't want to talk, listening when I needed to vent, offering practical support without demanding gratitude or affection in return. It was the most genuine kindness anyone had shown me in years, and I found myself falling for him in ways that had nothing to do with our arrangement, and everything to do with who he actually was beneath the dangerous sophistication. 6 weeks into our 3-month agreement, I woke up in my separate bedroom suite and realized I didn't want separate bedrooms anymore. The careful distance we'd been maintaining felt increasingly artificial, a holdover from when we'd both been protecting ourselves from potential hurt, rather than acknowledging what was actually developing between us. I found Dante in his study, reviewing something across multiple computer screens that he quickly closed when I entered, and I appreciated that he still maintained boundaries around the parts of his business I was better off not knowing about. "We need to renegotiate our arrangement," I said without preamble, nervous in ways I hadn't been since first approaching him about hijacking his jet. "The 3-month timeline doesn't work for me anymore." Something flickered in his expression, carefully controlled but not fast enough to hide what might have been hurt. "You want to leave early. I understand. The media attention has been intense, and you've accomplished what you set out to do in terms of establishing independence from your father. I can arrange transportation and financial support immediately if you'd prefer not to complete the full term." "No," I interrupted, moving closer. "I don't want to leave early. I want to renegotiate because 3 months isn't enough, and I'm tired of pretending this is temporary when I don't want it to be." I took a breath, forcing myself to be honest in ways I'd been avoiding. "I'm in love with you, Dante, not performing for cameras or playing a role. Actually in love with you in the terrifying permanent way, where thinking about leaving in a month makes me feel like I'm suffocating. And if you don't feel the same way, tell me now so I can start protecting myself emotionally, because staying here knowing this is just a business arrangement is going to destroy me." The silence stretched long enough that I started preparing for rejection, for the kind explanation that he cared about me but not like that our chemistry was real, but love required more than weeks of cohabitation and strategic public appearances. But then Dante was standing, crossing the space between us, and his hands were framing my face with the reverence usually reserved for fragile, precious things. "You terrify me," he said quietly. 8 years ago when you left, it broke something in me I thought was permanently damaged. I convinced myself I didn't want to feel that vulnerable again, that keeping everything transactional was safer than risking actual emotional investment. Then you showed up trying to steal my jet, and every defense I'd built just collapsed. I've been in love with you probably since the second day you were here. Definitely by the time you hacked your father's files with that look of fierce determination like you were going to war. I didn't want to pressure you when you'd just escaped one controlling relationship and might interpret my feelings as another form of cage. Loving someone isn't the same as controlling them, I said, understanding something fundamental about the difference between my father's possession and what Dante was offering. You've given me more freedom in 6 weeks than I had in 26 years with my family, the choice to stay or leave, the space to figure out who I am without constant surveillance, the support to fight battles without taking them over, and the support to fight for me. That's not a cage, that's partnership. He kissed me then, and it was different from the careful kisses we'd shared for cameras, or the passionate encounters when chemistry had temporarily overwhelmed caution. This was a promise and a commitment, and the kind of honesty that came from two people choosing each other without coercion, arrangement, or strategic advantage. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I felt something fundamental click into place, like I'd finally found where I was supposed to be all along. "So we're renegotiating," Dante said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "What are your new terms? No more separate bedrooms. No more predetermined expiration date. No more performance versus reality. We exist together and figure out what that means as we go." I pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "And when you're ready, eventually, probably not immediately but someday, I want to know about the parts of your business you've been carefully keeping me separate from. Not because I need to be involved, but because I don't want there to be sections of your life that are off limits to me. Some of those sections are kept separate to protect you," Dante said carefully. "Things that are safer for you not to know because knowledge creates complicity, and I'd rather take those risks alone than drag you into legal jeopardy. I appreciate that, but I'm also choosing you, knowing you operate in gray areas that probably cross into illegal occasionally. I don't need details, but I need to know generally what I'm accepting, so I can make informed decisions about the life we're building." I touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I've spent my entire life having information controlled and filtered to manipulate my choices. I can't be in a relationship where that continues, even if the motivation is protection, rather than control." He considered that, and I watched him process the distinction I was drawing between withholding information to control versus withholding to protect, understanding why the first was unacceptable, even when the second came from care. "My family is involved in import-export businesses that occasionally ignore regulatory restrictions. We move goods across borders using methods customs officials would object to if they knew the details. We also provide financial services to people who need to move money without government oversight, which involves techniques that banking regulators consider problematic. Nothing violent, nothing that directly hurts people, but definitely illegal in most jurisdictions. Smuggling and money laundering," I summarized, appreciating his honesty, even as I processed the reality of what he was describing. "Is anyone getting hurt? Are you trafficking people, weapons, or drugs that are destroying communities?" "No, absolutely not. Those are lines I won't cross regardless of profit." Dante's voice carried conviction. "Luxury goods avoiding import taxes, art and antiquities that may have questionable provenance, and financial transactions for wealthy people avoiding their own country's economic restrictions. Victimless crimes in the sense that the only entities being harmed are governments collecting less tax revenue or maintaining less control over their citizens' money." I processed this information, comparing it against moral frameworks I'd developed during years of business ethics courses and my own attempts to define acceptable behavior versus unforgivable transgressions. Smuggling luxury goods to avoid taxes wasn't something I'd personally engage in, but it didn't trigger the visceral horror that human trafficking or drug distribution would have. Money laundering existed in a complicated ethical territory where helping wealthy people avoid authoritarian government control could be justified, even if the same techniques also enabled tax evasion and other financial crimes. "I can accept that," I said finally. "I'm not saying I approve completely, or that I'd participate directly, but I can accept that you operate in those spaces and still choose to be with you. As long as the lines you won't cross stay firm, as long as you're not hurting vulnerable people or enabling violence, I can live with the moral ambiguity." Relief crossed Dante's features, genuine enough that I understood how much my acceptance mattered to him. Most people can't make that distinction. They hear anything illegal and immediately categorize it as morally equivalent to violent crime. The fact that you can see gradations, understand context, means more than you probably realize. "I had a good teacher," I said, thinking about the ethics professor in graduate school who'd spent an entire semester challenging students to defend moral positions that felt absolute until examined critically. She used to say that rigid moral frameworks were signs of intellectual laziness, that truly ethical thinking required constant reevaluation based on context and consequences. I hated her at the time because she made everything so complicated, but she was right. Easy answers are usually wrong answers when you're dealing with human behavior in complex systems. We spent the rest of the morning talking, not about logistics or public appearances, but about the future, the kind of life we might build together if we stopped treating our relationship as a temporary arrangement and started approaching it as a permanent partnership. Dante owned properties in multiple countries, and we discussed which locations might work for extended stays versus which were purely functional real estate for business purposes. I eventually wanted to finish my graduate degree and pursue research in areas where my background in business and psychology intersected. He had connections at universities where I could study without my father's name overshadowing my own work. It felt surreal. Planning my future like this was actually happening. Like I was allowed to make choices about my life without them being predetermined by family obligation or business strategy. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying simultaneously, an unlimited set of possibilities that required me to figure out what I actually wanted rather than what I was supposed to want. For someone who'd spent 26 years being told how to dress, what to study, who to marry, even what career path to pursue, genuine autonomy was foreign territory I'd need to learn to navigate. Jessica called that afternoon, her voice carrying an urgency that put me on alert immediately. Sophia, I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else. Father's in the hospital. He had a heart attack last night. Relatively minor, according to doctors, but serious enough that he's being kept for observation and treatment. Guilt hit me like a physical blow. Is he okay? Is he stable? Should I come back to New York? The questions tumbled out before I could think them through. An automatic response to hearing a parent was hospitalized regardless of our current status. He's stable. They're saying full recovery is likely with lifestyle changes and medication. Jessica paused. But Sophia, he's refusing to see you. When I mentioned calling you, he specifically said he doesn't want you at the hospital. That you made your choice, and he's made his. I'm sorry. I know that's hard to hear. It shouldn't have hurt, given that he'd disowned me and tried to have me committed to psychiatric treatment. But some part of me had apparently still been hoping for eventual reconciliation. Some future moment when he'd acknowledge his mistakes, and we'd find a way to rebuild the relationship on a healthier foundation. His refusal to see me, even while hospitalized, made clear that wasn't going to happen, that the bridge between us was burned beyond reconstruction. Thank you for telling me, I managed. Keep me updated on his condition, but respect his wishes about me not visiting. I don't want to cause him additional stress during recovery. After ending the call, I found myself crying for the first time since everything had started, grieving the father I'd wished I had, rather than the one who actually existed. Dante held me while I fell apart, not offering empty reassurances or suggesting the estrangement might be temporary. He just provided silent support, understanding that sometimes grief needed space to exist without being fixed or minimized. He might never forgive me, I said when I could speak again. We might never have a relationship again beyond hostile distance. I chose my freedom, and the cost was losing my father permanently. You didn't lose your father, Dante said gently. You lost the illusion that you had a father who loved you the way parents are supposed to love children. What existed before was a cage that looked like family. Control that masqueraded as concern. This actually isn't a loss, Sophia. This is finally seeing clearly what was never there to begin with. The next few weeks tested that perspective as I navigated the strange territory of being truly orphaned, despite having a living parent. My mother had died when I was 6, too young to really remember her beyond fragmented impressions of warmth and laughter. My father had been my only family for 20 years, and even though that relationship had been dysfunctional and controlling, it had still been familiar. Now I had to build an identity entirely separate from the Chen family, figure out who Sophia was without the surname, connections, and automatic social positioning that had always defined me. Dante's friends gradually became my friends, without pressure. Adriana Volkov taught me about international finance in ways that had nothing to do with my business degree, and everything to do with the practical reality of moving money creatively. Marcus Chen, who is not related to my family, included me in discussions about his latest technology ventures, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspective, despite my lack of expertise. The fashion designer whose name appeared on half my borrowed wardrobe turned out to be brilliant, funny, and utterly unimpressed by wealth or status, which made her refreshingly easy to be around. I was building life, actual life rather than performed existence. And somewhere during those weeks, the 3-month deadline we'd agreed initially came and went without either of us mentioning it. I realized it had passed only when I was reviewing the calendar for upcoming events and noticed we were already into month 4. The arrangement that was supposed to be temporary had become permanent so gradually that there'd been no specific moment of transition, just steady evolution from performance to reality. We missed our deadline, I told Dante one evening, when we were having dinner on the terrace overlooking mountains that had somehow become home. 3 months ended 2 weeks ago. You technically fulfilled your obligation, provided transportation away from my wedding, and protected me while I established independence. I should be leaving for whatever new life I was supposed to build elsewhere. Do you want to leave? Dante asked, and I heard a genuine question rather than manipulation or pressure. No, I want to stay here, with you, building whatever this becomes long-term. I reached across the table to take his hand. But I also want to make sure you're not just continuing this because you feel obligated, because we never formally ended our arrangement. If you want me to leave, if 3 months was enough and you're ready to move on, I need you to tell me honestly, rather than letting me stay out of guilt or responsibility. Dante set down his wine glass with deliberate care, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was actually going to tell me our time was up, that I'd misread everything. He'd just been too polite to enforce our original deadline. But then he was standing, moving around the table to where I sat, and pulling me up into his arms with an intensity that made my breath catch. I'm not continuing this out of obligation, he said, voice rough with emotion he rarely let show so openly. I'm continuing this because somewhere between you trying to steal my jet, you hacking your father's files, and you choosing to stay even after you didn't have to, I fell completely in love with you. The kind of love where thinking about you leaving makes me understand why people do stupid, desperate things. The kind where I'd burn down everything I've built if that's what keeping you safe required. My heart hammered against my ribs. That's extremely intense and slightly concerning from a proportional response standpoint. I'm aware. He smiled, and it was that rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. I'm not good at moderate feelings, Sophia. I either don't care at all, or I care so completely that it becomes the organizing principle of my entire existence. You've become the organizing principle. Everything else is just details I manage between making sure you're happy. I need to tell you something, I said, gathering courage for honesty I'd been avoiding. When I hijacked your jet, it wasn't completely random. I knew you kept planes at that terminal. I knew there was a chance I'd encounter you. Some part of me was hoping for it, even though I told myself I was looking for any escape route. I forced myself to meet his eyes. I think I've been in love with you since we were 18, and everything I've done since then has been trying to convince myself I wasn't. Running away to college, avoiding relationships that might become serious, even agreeing to marry Harrison. It was all me trying to prove I didn't need you specifically when the truth was, I'd already decided no one else would ever measure up. So we've both been idiots for 8 years, Dante said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Wasting time being apart because we were too scared to admit what we actually felt. I vote we stop doing that. I vote we get engaged. Actually engaged this time. Without arrangement or deadline or business strategy. Just 2 people choosing each other because nothing else makes sense. The proposal was characteristically unromantic and perfect precisely because it was honest rather than performed. No elaborate setup or ring produced from a hidden pocket. Just Dante standing on our terrace at sunset, asking me to commit to the future we'd build together on our own terms. Yes, I said, and it was the easiest decision I'd ever made. Yes to engagement. Yes to building life together. Yes to everything as long as it's real and voluntary and based on actual feelings rather than obligation. He kissed me then, and it tasted like promise and possibility, and the particular sweetness that came from choosing someone who chose you back with equal intensity. When we finally broke apart, the sun had set completely, leaving us in darkness punctuated by lights from the house and stars beginning to emerge overhead. We should probably tell people, Dante said practically, before someone reports we've been fraudulently claiming to be engaged for months. Make it official with an actual proposal story and a formal announcement. Do we have to make it public immediately? I asked, wanting to keep this moment private just slightly longer. Can we have a few days where it's just ours before it becomes another media story and social spectacle? We can have whatever you want. Dante's thumb traced my cheekbone. This is our life now, Sophia. No more performing for other people's expectations or managing narratives for strategic advantage. We make decisions based on what actually makes us happy, and everyone else can adjust their opinions accordingly. The radical nature of that freedom still caught me off guard sometimes. The realization that I could make choices purely because I wanted to, rather than because they served larger strategic purposes. It was intoxicating and occasionally overwhelming. The weight of having no one to blame if things went wrong because I was finally operating with genuine autonomy. We spent the next 3 days in our private engagement bubble, telling no one and just existing together without the performance aspect that had characterized so much of our relationship. We talked about the actual wedding this time, what kind of ceremony we'd want, who we'd invite, and whether we cared about traditional elements or preferred something completely unconventional. I realized I didn't have strong opinions about most of it, because I'd never been allowed to have opinions about my previous almost weddings. They'd been events planned by other people for other people's purposes, and my only role was showing up appropriately dressed. "What do you actually want?" Dante asked when I'd spent 20 minutes equivocating about venue options. "Not what you think you should want or what sounds reasonable. What does your ideal wedding look like if there are no constraints?" I thought about it, really felt, instead of defaulting to what seemed appropriate. "Small," I said finally. "Maybe 20 people, just the ones who actually matter to both of us. Somewhere beautiful but not formal, like here on the mountain or somewhere with ocean views. Food that's actually good rather than impressive looking. Music we choose because we like it, not because it's traditional. And absolutely no performance aspect where we're on display for people to judge and evaluate. That's achievable." Dante pulled out his phone, already making notes. "Private ceremony, limited guest list, focus on experience rather than spectacle. We can plan something for next month if you want, or next year if you prefer a longer engagement. Entirely your timeline." "Next month feels fast," I said. But even as I spoke, I realized fast didn't mean wrong. But I also don't see the point in waiting when we're both certain. What's extended engagement going to prove that living together for months hasn't already demonstrated? "Practical as always," Dante said with affection. "1 month then. Small ceremony, people who matter. Focus on commitment rather than production value. I'll handle logistics. You handle deciding what would make you genuinely happy, rather than what checks appropriate boxes." The public announcement of our engagement came a week later, carefully orchestrated to control the narrative before speculation could spiral out of control. We gave an exclusive interview to Isabella Russo, the journalist who'd initially helped establish our relationship story, and this time, every word we spoke was genuine rather than strategic fiction. The chemistry between us was obvious enough that even cynical media observers commented on how clearly in love we appeared, how different this engagement seemed from the arranged business merger I'd run from months earlier. The response was mixed, as expected. Some people found our story romantic, celebrating that I'd found happiness after escaping a problematic arrangement. Others criticized me for instability, suggesting that someone who'd left 2 engagements had fundamental character flaws that made me an unsuitable partner. A few conspiracy theorists insisted Dante had orchestrated everything, that he'd somehow convinced me to run from Harrison specifically so he could reclaim me for his own purposes. That last theory was close enough to reality to make me uncomfortable, even though the actual truth was more complicated than their simplified version suggested. We exchanged rings that Dante had commissioned from a designer who specialized in pieces with hidden meanings. Mine had a tiny engraving inside the band in Italian that translated to "She who flew to me." He had a matching inscription in English, "He who caught her." They were perfect, romantic, slightly absurd, and absolutely genuine in ways that expensive diamonds and traditional settings would never have achieved. The reception was a casual dinner on the terrace as the sun set over the ocean, conversation and laughter, and the kind of relaxed celebration that happened when no one was performing for cameras or maintaining social facades. Someone brought out guitars after dinner, and we ended up with an impromptu concert under the stars. At the same time, Adriana taught me Russian drinking songs that probably shouldn't be sung at weddings, but were so entertaining that I couldn't help but sing along. Around midnight, when most guests had retired to rooms throughout the estate, I found myself standing at the cliff edge, watching the moonlight on the water, while processing the surreal reality that I was actually married. Legally, permanently married to Dante Moretti, the man I'd jilted 8 years ago and then hijacked my way back to when life became unbearable. The path from that desperate escape to this moment of genuine happiness had been chaotic and painful, and absolutely nothing like the neat narrative arc I'd imagined my life would follow. Having regrets? Dante's arm slid around my waist from behind, pulling me back against his chest. Second thoughts about legally binding yourself to someone involved in smuggling and money laundering? No regrets, I said honestly, although I'm still processing that this is actually my life now. 6 months ago, I was drowning in my father's control, engaged to someone who viewed me as an acquisition, convinced I'd never escape the prison of family obligation. Now I'm married to you, living in places I didn't know existed, building relationships with people who actually see me as a person rather than a Chen family representative. It feels simultaneously like everything changed, and like this was always where I was supposed to end up. Fate is lazy storytelling, Dante said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. We made choices, consequences happened, we dealt with fallout and kept choosing each other. That's not destiny. That's just two stubborn people refusing to accept lives that other people tried to force on them. Very romantic, I said dryly. You should write greeting cards. I'll add it to my business portfolio between the smuggling and money laundering. He turned me to face him, hands framing my face in the gesture that had become a familiar comfort. I love you, Sophia Moretti. I love that you tried to steal my jet. I love that you hacked your father's files without hesitation when survival required it. I love that you cry at sunset and laugh at Adriana's inappropriate jokes, and still sometimes wake up at 3 a.m, panicking about whether you made the right choice by leaving your family. I love all of it, even the complicated parts, especially the complicated parts. Sophia Moretti, I repeated, testing how the name felt. I'd legally changed it that morning, abandoning Chen entirely rather than doing the hyphenated compromise some women chose. It felt like shedding skin that had never quite fit, becoming someone new while also becoming more authentically myself than I'd ever been allowed to be. It sounds like someone interesting. Someone who makes her own choices and deals with consequences, and doesn't apologize for taking up space in the world. It sounds like someone who's going to be incredible at whatever she decides to do next, Dante said. Have you thought more about whether you want to finish your graduate degree or pursue something completely different? I had been thinking about it, actually, during quiet moments when I wasn't processing trauma, or planning weddings, or learning to navigate life without a family safety net. I want to work with other people trying to escape controlling family situations. I said slowly. Use my psychology background and personal experience to help people who are where I was 6 months ago, trapped and desperate and convinced they don't have options. Maybe start a foundation that provides legal support, safe housing, and financial resources for people leaving abusive family structures disguised as concern. That's brilliant, Dante said immediately. I'll fund it. Whatever you need, legal team, properties for safe housing, connections to therapists and employment counselors, it's yours. This is exactly the kind of thing our resources should support. Our resources, I repeated, still adjusting to the reality that Dante's considerable wealth was now legally mine as well, that I'd gone from being disowned and cut off to having access to more money than I'd ever had under my father's control. I'm going to need time to get comfortable with that concept. Being actually wealthy rather than just borrowing access to family money feels strange. You'll adapt, Dante said with confidence. You've adapted to everything else that's happened. This is just one more adjustment in a year that's been nothing but constant adjustment. We stayed at the cliff edge until dawn began lighting the eastern sky, talking about future plans and possibilities, and the life we'd build together now that we were actually married, rather than just going through an engagement for strategic purposes. It felt surreal and absolutely right simultaneously, like I'd finally found the place I was supposed to be after 26 years of existing in spaces designed for someone else. The foundation launched 3 months after the wedding, operating initially out of a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn that Dante purchased and converted into offices and temporary housing for people escaping controlling family situations. We called it the Wingspan Foundation, a name deliberately chosen to evoke both freedom and the support structure needed to achieve flight. I'd learned that escaping wasn't just about physical departure. It required legal resources, financial independence, therapeutic support, and a community of people who understood the particular complications of leaving families that used love and obligation as weapons of control. Our first client was a 21-year-old man whose parents had been forcing him toward medical school, despite his complete lack of interest or aptitude, threatening to disown him and publicly destroy his reputation if he pursued his actual passion for culinary arts. His situation was less dramatic than mine had been. No psychiatric commitment threats or arranged marriages, but the underlying dynamic was identical. Parents who valued their vision of his life more than his actual happiness, who wielded financial control and family loyalty as tools of manipulation, who genuinely believed they were acting in his best interest while systematically destroying his autonomy. We provided him with legal representation to navigate the emancipation process, connected him with a culinary school that offered a scholarship for his specific circumstances, and arranged housing while he established independence. Watching him transform over weeks from defeated and hopeless to energized and purposeful reminded me why this work mattered, why my own painful experience could become a foundation for helping others avoid or escape similar traps. The foundation grew quickly, partially because there was a genuine need, and partially because Dante's connections brought resources and attention that accelerated what might have taken years to build organically. We assembled a team of therapists who specialized in family trauma, lawyers who understood the complicated intersection of family law and financial control, and career counselors who helped people identify paths forward when they'd been forced toward predetermined futures. Within 6 months, we were serving 30 clients actively and had a waiting list that suggested we'd need to expand facilities soon. Media attention was inevitable given my personal story and Dante's profile, but we managed it carefully, using publicity strategically to raise awareness and funding while protecting clients' privacy absolutely. I conducted selective interviews, discussing my own experience in ways that illuminated patterns without exploiting pain for entertainment. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages from people who'd experienced similar family dynamics, who'd felt trapped and alone, and who'd been convinced their only options were compliance or complete loss of family connection. Some of those messages came from people in my extended Chen family network, cousins and distant relatives who reached out privately to say they understood why I'd left, that they'd experienced similar pressure, even if they'd ultimately chosen compliance over rebellion. A few apologized for not supporting me more publicly, explaining they couldn't risk their own positions, but wanted me to know they didn't believe my father's narrative about mental instability or betrayal. The messages were bittersweet, validating that my experience hadn't been unique, while also highlighting how effectively fear of consequences kept people silent, even when they recognized abuse. Jessica became increasingly involved with the foundation, volunteering during breaks from Columbia, and eventually joining the board despite knowing it would further strain her relationship with our father. She'd watched my transformation from desperate runaway to confident woman building meaningful work, and it had apparently inspired her to question her own compliance with family expectations. We grew closer during those months than we'd ever been as children, building a sister relationship based on genuine connection rather than shared trauma and family obligation. My father's health improved following his heart attack, but our estrangement remained absolute. I heard about his life through Jessica's carefully neutral updates. He'd taken a consulting position with a tech firm after leaving Chen Technologies, maintaining professional relevance while stepping back from the intensity that had contributed to his cardiac event. He'd started dating someone, a widow around his age, whom Jessica described as kind and remarkably good at not tolerating his controlling tendencies. Apparently, nearly losing everything had prompted some self-reflection, though not enough to reach out to his disowned daughter or acknowledge his role in driving me away. I told myself I'd made peace with the permanent estrangement, that I didn't need his approval or reconciliation to be happy. Most days that was true, but occasionally I'd see fathers with daughters at foundation events, watching them interact with affection and support and mutual respect, and I'd feel the grief of never having had that, of losing even the dysfunctional version before understanding it might be repairable if both parties were willing to try. Dante noticed those moments, the brief shadows that crossed my face when confronted with functional parent-child relationships. He never pushed me to articulate the grief, just provided silent support and reminded me that chosen family could be as meaningful as a biological connection. His own relationship with his father was complicated, strained by disagreements about business ethics and the directions Dante had taken that diverged from family tradition. We were both building lives separate from parental approval, learning that autonomy sometimes required accepting that people who were supposed to love you unconditionally might actually have extensive conditions you couldn't or wouldn't meet. A year after our wedding, the foundation hosted a gala fundraiser, the kind of event I'd once attended as Richard Chen's decorative daughter, rather than as a person with my own identity and purpose. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in a ballroom wearing a designer gown, welcoming New York's elite to support work that directly contradicted everything my father's approach to parenting had represented. Some of the guests had attended my failed wedding to Harrison, had witnessed my scandal, and had probably gossiped extensively about my instability and poor judgment. Now they were writing checks to support the foundation, whether out of genuine belief in the mission or simply because Dante's presence made it socially advantageous to appear supportive. I was giving a speech about the Foundation's first-year impact when I saw him enter the ballroom. Richard Chen, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered, standing at the back of the room with the woman Jessica had mentioned, his girlfriend, who apparently had enough influence to bring him to the event hosted by the daughter he'd disowned. Our eyes met across the crowded space, and something complicated passed between us. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of acknowledgement that we'd both made choices that had led here, that the path forward might eventually include conversation, even if it never included restoration of the relationship we'd had before. I finished my speech without faltering, thanking supporters, sharing success stories, and making the case for why this work mattered. When I stepped down from the podium, Dante was there immediately, his hand finding mine in silent support. "He's here," I murmured. "My father, in the back with someone who must be his girlfriend." "I know. I saw him arrive." Dante's thumb traced circles on my wrist. "Do you want me to have security escort them out? Or do you want to attempt conversation?" I took a breath, steadying myself against the surge of conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, grief, and underneath it all, a small, fragile hope I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "I want to talk to him. Not tonight, not in front of all these people, but maybe before he leaves." "If he's willing?" Dante squeezed my hand. "I'll arrange it. Private room, just you and him, unless you want me there for support." "I need to do this alone," I said, understanding that whatever conversation my father and I might have needed to happen without Dante's protective presence, without anyone mediating or buffering between us. "But thank you for offering." The gala continued around us, guests mingling and drinking expensive wine, and writing checks that would fund another year of helping people escape the kind of control my father had wielded so thoroughly. I worked the room with Dante, thanking donors, sharing stories, and performing the social choreography I'd been trained in since childhood. But part of my attention remained on my father, watching him watch me, seeing him observe the life I'd built in the year since our estrangement. Near the end of the evening, Marcus Vale appeared at my elbow with quiet efficiency. "Mr. Chen has agreed to meet with you privately. There's a study prepared on the second floor. Whenever you're ready." I excused myself from the conversation I'd been having with a potential major donor, found Dante to let him know where I'd be, and made my way upstairs on legs that felt unsteady despite months of confidence I'd built. The study was precisely the kind of space designed for difficult conversations. Comfortable furniture arranged to encourage dialogue, soft lighting that reduced confrontational intensity, enough privacy that we wouldn't be overheard or interrupted. My father stood when I entered, and I noticed details I'd missed from across the ballroom. He'd lost weight, probably from the heart attack and subsequent lifestyle changes. His hair had more gray than I remembered. He looked tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, like the past year had aged him more than the previous decade. But his eyes were the same, sharp and assessing and still trying to categorize me into frameworks he understood. "Sophia." My name in his voice sounded strange after a year of silence. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain either," I admitted, remaining standing because sitting felt too vulnerable. "Why are you here, Father? Jessica said you refused to even hear my name mentioned. What changed?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him struggle with words in ways I'd never seen before. Richard Chen had always been articulate, commanding language as effectively as he commanded boardrooms and business negotiations. Seeing him falter was unsettling, proof that something fundamental had shifted. "I nearly died," he said finally. The heart attack, the doctors told me afterward, was that I'd been minutes away from it being fatal rather than survivable. And when I was lying in that hospital bed, facing mortality in ways I'd never had to confront before, I realized that I might die estranged from my only surviving child, and that prospect terrified me more than death itself. He moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I told myself for months that you were the one who'd betrayed our family, that you'd chosen to destroy everything I'd built out of selfishness and immaturity. But watching you tonight, seeing the work you're doing, the life you've built, I had to confront the possibility that maybe I was the one who'd failed." The admission hung in the air between us, more vulnerable than anything I'd ever heard from him. I wanted to accept it immediately, to fall into easy forgiveness and restoration of the relationship. But I'd learned over the past year that healing required honesty, not comfortable fiction that ignored actual harm. You tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could control my voting shares, I said quietly. You collected months of footage, editing it to make me look unstable. You had doctors prepared to testify that I was a danger to myself. That wasn't parenting, Father. That was systematic abuse disguised as concern. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I've spent the past year in therapy, actually talking to a professional about my behavior, rather than just assuming my perspective was correct. She's helped me understand that control and love aren't the same thing, that protecting you meant respecting your autonomy rather than eliminating it. I destroyed our relationship because I couldn't distinguish between keeping you safe and keeping you compliant. Why now? I asked, needing to understand his timing. Why come here tonight after a year of refusing contact? Because Margaret convinced me that pride was a poor substitute for having a relationship with my daughter. He turned from the window. My girlfriend lost her own daughter years ago to a drunk driver. She tells me regularly that I'm wasting time I might not have, that waiting for you to apologize first, or for the situation to resolve itself, is cowardice, disguised as dignity. She's forthright in ways I'm still learning to appreciate. Despite everything, I felt a small smile form. Jessica said she's good at not tolerating your controlling tendencies. She's terrifyingly effective at that, yes. Something that might have been affection crossed his face. She's been encouraging me to reach out for months. Tonight I finally found the courage to actually do it, helped considerably by seeing the undeniable evidence that you've thrived without me, rather than collapsed as I'd convinced myself would happen. We stood in silence, years of damage between us and the tentative possibility of something different ahead. I understood this wasn't a complete reconciliation, that one conversation couldn't repair systematic control and betrayal. But it was the beginning of a path forward, if we were both willing to do the uncomfortable work. I can't just forgive everything and return to being your daughter in the way you want, I said carefully. Too much has happened. You hurt me too deeply, and I've built a life that doesn't include you in the way it once did. I understand. He moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. I'm not asking for immediate restoration of what we had before. I'm asking for the possibility of building something new, whatever that might look like. Maybe we start with occasional dinners and supervised conversations, where Margaret or Dante can intervene if either of us falls into old patterns. Maybe we work with a family therapist who can help us navigate this. Maybe it takes years. Or maybe we discover that the damage is too extensive and the best we can achieve is cordial distance. But I'm asking for the chance to try, Sophia. I'm asking you to consider that people can change, even controlling fathers who spent decades getting it wrong. I thought about it, weighing the risk of letting him back into my life against the possibility of having some version of a father-daughter relationship I'd always wanted but never had. The foundation had taught me that family reconciliation was complicated, that sometimes the healthiest choice was maintaining boundaries. But sometimes healing required giving people a genuine opportunity to demonstrate change. Supervised conversations, I said finally. Monthly, maybe, with Dante or Margaret present. Clear boundaries about what topics are acceptable and what remain off limits. And the first time you try to control my choices or question my judgment or suggest you know better what I should be doing with my life, the arrangement ends immediately. I won't return to that dynamic, Father. Not for anything. Those terms are more than fair. Relief flooded his expression. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for being willing to try when I've given you every reason to refuse. We didn't hug or exchange affection that would have felt forced and premature. But we shook hands, a formal acknowledgement of agreement between two people trying to figure out if a relationship was possible after catastrophic damage. It wasn't the happy reunion films portrayed, but it was honest, which mattered more. When I returned to the gala, Dante was waiting near the staircase, his expression questioning. How did it go? It was a beginning, I said, taking his hand. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that maybe eventual healing is possible if we're both willing to work for it. He's changed, or claims to have changed, and I'm willing to test that carefully and with extensive boundaries. That's incredibly generous of you, considering what he did. Dante pulled me close. I'm proud of you for being willing to try, and I'll support whatever level of relationship you decide is healthy, including none at all if that's ultimately what you need. The gala wound down, guests departing with promises of continued support and satisfied expressions from successful fundraising. Jessica found me before leaving, pulling me aside with urgent energy. "I saw Father talking to you." "What happened? Are you okay? Did he apologize or make excuses?" "Both," I said honestly. "He acknowledged he was wrong, which is more than I expected. We're going to try supervised conversations and see if we can build something healthier than what we had before. But Jess, I need you to understand this doesn't change anything about you. You don't have to choose between us or feel pressured to facilitate reconciliation or mediate our relationship. You get to have whatever relationship with him works for you, independent of what I decide." She hugged me fiercely. "I love you, and I'm so proud of everything you've built and who you've become. Even if Father never figures it out, I want you to know that I see it, and it's extraordinary." By the time Dante and I returned to our home in the mountains, it was nearly 3 a.m, and both of us were exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening. We stood on the same terrace where we'd gotten engaged, looking at stars and processing everything that had happened. "A year ago, I was hijacking your jet," I said, marveling at how much had changed. Desperate and terrified and convinced I had no options except running. Now I'm running a foundation, married to you, and potentially rebuilding a relationship with my father on healthier terms. It feels like a different life entirely. "It is a different life," Dante said, arms sliding around my waist. "You chose it, fought for it, built it from nothing when everything that had defined you was stripped away. That's not luck or circumstance. That's courage and determination, and refusing to accept the limitations other people tried to impose." "We built it," I corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you catching me when I fell, providing resources and protection, and a partnership that made rebuilding possible. You gave me a foundation to stand on while I figured out who I wanted to be." "Then we'll keep building together," Dante said. "Whatever comes next, whatever challenges or opportunities, we'll handle them the way we've handled everything else. Together and with absolute refusal to accept lives other people think we should be living." I turned in his arms to kiss him, tasting promise and future, and the particular sweetness of choosing someone who chose you back with equal ferocity. The foundation would grow. My father and I would navigate our complicated reconciliation or fail trying, and life would present challenges I couldn't predict. But standing there with Dante, looking at stars over mountains that had become home, I understood that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for when I hijacked that jet. Not just escape from control, but genuine freedom to build life on my own terms. Not just survival, but actual thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. Not just independence, but partnership with someone who understood that love meant supporting autonomy rather than eliminating it. I was Sophia Moretti, formerly Chen, a woman who'd hijacked a stranger's jet to escape an arranged marriage, only to discover he was the man she'd jilted years before. A woman who'd chosen freedom over family, built a foundation from scandal, and turned a desperate escape into a purposeful life. A woman who'd learned that sometimes the most romantic stories began with federal aviation crimes and ended with actual love built on choice rather than obligation. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be.